Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Marks, and I'm responding to questions from Brittany Watson. So let's get into it. So the first question I have, it says, after reading the article, one of the main takeaways is that culturally relevant curriculum should be chosen and delivered in meaningful ways to the intended students to validate their personal experiences and cultural heritages, or teach content that is entirely new to the ethnically and culturally diverse students, but in a way that is easy to understand. As a teacher, how would you go about doing the above things? So that's a big question. There's a lot there. And I think, especially depending on an individual teacher's content area, grade level, and their own just personality and teaching style, there you can potentially get a pretty wide array of answers to this. For me, I think the most important thing to start with this question, the most important thing to start with when trying to implement meaningful, culturally responsive teaching is a teacher needs to understand their students' backgrounds for a number of reasons. One, you need to know what perspectives and experiences to include and to address. You also need to assess the developmental level of your students on a more for more practical concern, so that way you can more effectively design meaningful instruction. The example from Gay, where she mentioned, I think it was a second grade classroom that had that was using readings that were really good. They offered really good insight and were really good representations of diverse experiences, but if the resources or materials being used are developmentally inappropriate and not working on an instructional level, then that's bad instruction. That's not meaningful instruction. So you have to know your students' developmental level so you can make your instruction actually meaningful and effective. If you understand, kind of going along, assessing student backgrounds and their developmental levels, understanding student interests and their own past experiences and background knowledge as well, it makes it easier to design an engaging curriculum that can actually get them to get interested in some of these different cultures or viewpoints and perspectives that they might not have been exposed to previously, or get them more excited to look at this material in a new way. And kind of going off of something I said there as well, it's important to understand the student's background knowledge with these the cultural experiences and perspectives that a teacher's trying to incorporate into a curriculum. It makes it easier to design instruction that will actually reach the students where they're at and hopefully have a more constructive and meaningful impact on the students than either assuming they know more or have experienced more than they have, and therefore your students are lost, or the opposite of that, where a teacher does not really assumes that the students know less or have experienced less than they have, and the content it's not engaging, it's not anything new, which again, I think if the point of culturally responsive teaching seems to be both engaging students in these experiences and trying to provide a new perspective on cultural diversity for students. Then, after understanding your students' backgrounds, I think the more specific methodology that will be implemented, the more specific ways that teachers can go about implementing a culturally relevant curriculum in their teaching will depend on their content, their own teaching styles. So for me, coming from a background teaching social studies and English, I'm going to rely much more heavily on supplemental materials to both bring these to try and incorporate these perspectives and experiences into my class, but also just from my own perspective, I think it's important to try and provide as direct link as possible to a more authentic viewpoint on diverse experiences and cultures. So for English, that would mean incorporating readings, stories, or materials either written about and telling stories from different cultures or providing insight into these different cultural experiences, or incorporating materials and sources written by authors with more diverse backgrounds. In history, for me, I think the prime opportunity in history to incorporate these different perspectives is through primary sources from representatives of these diverse cultural groups that provide more of a direct window into the past on the experience of this person and potentially the group as a whole, to provide more of a direct link to that experience, a direct link from that experience to my students today. Okay, so I think that's question 1. Question 2 asks, teachers have no control over the content in standardized tests. How can you, as a teacher, help students, especially ethnically diverse students, succeed when it comes to high-stakes testing? Is it possible? And this is an interesting question from the sense that, yeah, it does kind of bring up some practical concerns for teachers today, given the wide impact that standardized testing has on education. I think the most important thing to bear in mind, I think at least for me, how I would generally go about trying to help students, regardless of ability level or cultural background, succeed when it comes to high stakes testing, would be trying to find ways that I can teach my standards that will still engage students in the content and get them comfortable with the material or skills that we're working with. And again, with my content backgrounds being in English and social studies, I think it is a bit easier to do that in those subjects than in other subjects like math or science, because the cultural standards for English especially, but social studies as well to an extent, are very broad, and they give the teacher a lot of freedom over how they want to go about covering these standards and teaching these skills or covering this material. English especially, looking at the English standards, the standards are very skills focused and very broad. So in that regard, the teacher does have a lot of choice over the specific materials they want to use to teach these skills and develop this content, develop these skills. So that does give the teacher a lot of choice to alter the curriculum in response to their students and try and include materials that will best engage each specific individual unique group of students, to try and get them engaged and interested in the material, so they're more willing to learn, which again, as I think we can all attest, if students want to learn, it's a lot easier to get them to learn. But also, if this material can get, if including different types of materials or readings or sources to teach the standards can get students more engaged and more comfortable with certain skills like writing, critically reading or analyzing readings, and analyzing a source or evaluating a source. all of those things, the more comfortable students are, the more confident they have with those abilities, the better they'll do on the test. They won't have as much anxiety going in, which should help them do better, and should at least give them a bit more preparation than they would have otherwise. Teaching primarily social studies now, fortunately, this is not nearly as much of a concern for me as it would be if I were teaching predominantly English, since social studies at the high school level is not a tested subject, so there's a lot more freedom to play around with the curriculum and try new things than there would be in the tested subjects. And I think something else that would be a good way to prepare students for success on standardized testing, it would be practice the important skills they need to know for the test. And that's not necessarily the content, but give them practice with having to respond to like extended writing prompts in a short amount of time. Give them practice to having to quickly read through a source or read through a source and identify key parts and basically break that source apart quickly. The more practice students have with those skills, the more prepared they're going to be for the test. So I guess ultimately the short version of that answer is you still have, my answer for how to help students succeed on standardized testing is you still have to teach the standards, but you can adapt, change the resources you use to teach them, and change some of the methods you might use in response to the unique attributes or characteristics of the specific group of students. And question 3, the last question, Brittany asks, how can we as educators help to create more ethnically diverse classrooms, even if your students are predominantly or all white? How does this apply to different subject areas? English is a little easier, but what about math and science and history? So again, a really relevant question that I think kind of touches on a point Brittany brought up in her first question, where she's asking, or where she kind of addresses how one of the objectives of culturally responsive teaching is to provide students with exposure to different cultural experiences and perspectives, and basically asking what are ways to go about that, even if you teach in a pretty homogenous district that lacks a lot of cultural diversity. And again, I think the main way we can work with this comes through just acknowledging and incorporating or addressing different perspectives and experiences. And depending on the subject area, this is easier said than done. English and social studies, I think, have a much easier time doing this than math and science. So with English, you can incorporate diverse sources or sources from diverse authors, or readings telling stories about different cultures or conveying the experiences of a culture that students might be unfamiliar with or have limited experience or interaction with. You can also kind of branch out and have students work with different things, like experimenting with different writing styles that originate or are common within certain cultures, or different forms of literature that are more or less common, or how different cultures, how their writing styles and how literature from diverse cultures kind of reflects the diversity within that culture. History, again, for me, primary sources I think are the best, one of the best, or at least one of the best ways to incorporate diverse perspectives, because again, they're just direct windows and direct links to the past. But within history, especially, I think it's important that we have students intentionally consider different experiences and how throughout history the human experience has not been uniform, and depending on the groups that you may or may not belong to, you're going to experience certain periods or events very differently depending on other groups. With math and science, I'm not gonna lie that I am having a hard time thinking about or trying to think of ways to try and address more ethnically or try and incorporate more cultural diversity in math and science curricula. For a couple of reasons. I mean, one, those subjects are not subjects I have a background in, but also I think it is generally just harder and more difficult. And I think probably the most effective way, and math and science people, please correct me or give more specifics, as my knowledge of teaching math and science is woefully inadequate. But I think highlighting the shared usage or the common usage of major concepts in math and science across cultural groups could be a way to include and incorporate more cultural diversity. But regardless of the subject, I think it is, at the end of the day, important to acknowledge different experiences and, where possible, incorporate resources, telling the stories or conveying the experiences or perspectives of different cultural groups, just to try and expose our students to those different experiences. Yeah, right. And okay, I think that covers all of them. This video is already substantially longer than I intended, but I look forward to seeing what everybody else's questions are and hearing what you all have to say.